Hello, everyone, and welcome back to SALT Talks. My name is John Darcy. I'm the managing director of SALT, which is a global thought leadership forum and networking platform at the intersection of finance, technology, and public policy. SALT Talks are a digital interview series with leading investors, creators, and thinkers. And our goal on these SALT Talks is the same as our goal at our SALT conferences, which we're excited to resume here in September of 2021 in New York City. But that's to provide a window into the mind of subject matter experts, as well as provide a platform for what we think are big ideas that are shaping the future. And we're very excited today to welcome Marc Polymeropoulos to SALT Talks. Marc worked for 26 years at the CIA before retiring in July of 2019 at the Senior Intelligence Service level. He was one of the CIA's most highly decorated operations officers who served in multiple field assignments for the U.S. government, specializing in counterterrorism, the Middle East, and South Asia, including extensive time in Iraq and Afghanistan. Prior to his retirement, Marc served at CIA headquarters and was in charge of the CIA's clandestine operations in Europe and Eurasia. He's recently out with a new book, which I highly recommend you go out and read, not just because of the great stories from his time in the CIA, but the leadership lessons you can draw from it. The book is called Clarity in Crisis: Leadership Lessons from the CIA. And it comes out today when we're airing this episode, June 8th. Marc has honed his unique leadership style based on 9 core principles. Each builds on the next and is designed for real-world application, where one often operates under time constraints and a lack of complete situational awareness. Marc describes how one must not fear, but instead wildly embrace this ambiguity. And also he teaches you about how to be resilient, which is, I think, something that we should touch on today. Hosting today's talk is Anthony Scaramucci, the founder and managing partner of Skybridge Capital, which is a global alternative investment firm. Anthony is also the chairman of SALT. Anthony has done a couple troop support missions to Afghanistan and Iraq, but obviously doesn't have the experience there that Marc does. Looking forward to a great conversation. Go ahead and take it away, Anthony.
Well, Marc, first of all, I'm going to hold up the book because I love promoting your book, okay, Clarity in Crisis: Leadership Lessons of the CIA. You know, a while back, Marc, I think you remember Jose Rodriguez.
Sure.
And so a while back, we had him at the SALT conference. He wrote a book, I think, called Hard Measures, maybe almost 10 years ago now. And your book reminded me of Jose's book in some ways, but I thought you contextualized leadership differently. He was really talking more about 9/11 and the CIA's response to 9/11. I guess where I want to start the interview is with your background. I want to go into your background first, how you grew up, how you got raised, but then I want to talk about the CIA and leadership as a field officer, which I think was very fascinating in this book.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. This is it's a great honor, and it's pretty interesting after my kind of 26 years living in the shadows that I'm out talking in public on this, but it's what I've wanted to do because I think, CIA is an indispensable institution and I want to talk to the American people about it and kind of teach people, what I learned there.
Tell us about your background, though. You grew up where? You're obviously, you're a Greek American. I'm an Italian American. So, Darcy's not us. Let's just put it that way. We'll leave it there. Okay. That's probably not politically correct in these times, but too bad. But go ahead.
So I have a wild background. So, first and foremost, I spent so much time in the Middle East, but before that, I was a middle-class kid from Highland Park, New Jersey. And I think one of the reasons why I succeeded later on in life is because I had this, really unique upbringing. So my mom was a Jewish girl from Long Island who goes off to Cornell. She meets my dad, who's on a Fulbright from Greece. He's as Greek as you can be, and he's at Cornell as well. And they fall in love, and it's kind of a pretty messy situation because each side, I don't think we're too thrilled with kind of crossing over in terms of different kind of religious lines. But then, so I grew up with this, celebrating everything. So we celebrated Greek Easter, Hanukkah, Passover, Christmas, you name it. And what really made that, I think, important for me is I had such a kind of open mind and open view of the world. Later on, I married a Lebanese Catholic, so it's unbelievable. We just need some Buddhists in the family, and then we'd be complete. But great upbringing. I love the Central Jersey area. My dad still lives there. He's a professor at Rutgers for 40 years. And that, while I spent my life running around the world, that really still is the place where my heart lies.
So you go into the CIA. Why?
So growing up, it was interesting. So my dad ended up doing a sabbatical as a professor. He went to Algeria. So when I was 10 years old, my mom, and think about as a parent doing this now, she put me on an airplane and I flew to meet him in Algeria. And my dad and I, for an entire month in an old beat up Volkswagen minibus, drove 2,000 miles through the Sahara Desert. So I thought I was Lawrence of Arabia. And this is what kind of got my itch for the Middle East. Along with, each summer going back to Greece. So my dad still had, his family was still there, and, they had a house on the island called Mykonos, which is a beautiful place. And so every summer I'd go back to Mykonos. So I'm getting this kind of, view of the world. And then I probably watched, a Tom Clancy film or two, and then off I go. And I went to Cornell for undergrad and grad school, but, I applied to the CIA, and that's the only job literally I have ever had.
You mentioned in the book that you have a kitchen table knowledge of Greek.
Yeah,
that's exactly your words.
Right.
What other languages do you speak?
So I learned Arabic through the CIA. They sent me to school for 2 years, and Spanish as well. And then, and of course now as I'm kind of getting older, I'm retired. It's all jumbled in my head. So I speak a little bit of everything. But on a serious note, what CIA really does well is teach our officers kind of the language skills that are required. So, and the hard target language skills are things like Arabic and Farsi and Russian and Chinese. And so, I spent 2 solid years learning Arabic, which was, that's a tough time because, you do this after you're trained as a case officer. Then they take you offline for 2 years. And so that's a lot of patience and a lot of kind of dedication to kind of get to the point. But if you want to go serve in the Middle East and do the stuff that we all did, you got to speak the language. You
just have such an amazing story. You talk about your field operational experience. Talk about the fact that you're not James Bond. It's a rough and tumble situation. What would you want the American people to take away from this book and your life experience about the CIA?
So I think, in terms of CIA as a whole, look, these are American patriots. We operate in the shadows. And so, the successes are never talked about and the failures are always kind of highlighted, especially when it gets caught up in politics. But my brothers and sisters at CIA, these are, to me, heroes of the United States because they operate, with so little fanfare. These are regular people. It's not like the old, the old days of kind of, all kind of, what they called it, white male in Yale. That's the old kind of stereotype of the agency. It's not at all like that. It's a place which is full of different ethnic groups, different kinds of, races, religions. And so it's a reflection of America. And then people who put their life on the line. And I think it was an institution in which I want more people to kind of understand because there's so many, misnomers about it, but it's a place I believe in, really deeply because, my colleagues were the ones standing on the ramparts, protecting the United States. And it's done with, very little fanfare, but boy, espionage is the world's second oldest profession.
Yeah, we won't talk about the first oldest profession because that'll also get me in trouble. But let's talk about terrorism.
Sure.
Let's talk about our ambiguous relationships in the Middle East. And so the CIA back in during the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, we funded what we were calling the Mujahideen, which were holy warriors. We helped them in their fight against the Russian Empire, the Soviet Empire. They turned on us effectively and became part of Al-Qaeda. And then they fomented a domestic terrorist attack on the United States. And so there's ambiguity there. And I was wondering if you could explain to people, in your view, what happened and the CIA's role in all of that.
So, boy, what a great word you used, ambiguity, because that kind of, it defines a lot of what I talk about in my book, but that defines, that's the intelligence business right there. It's, we live in the world of gray. So look, in order to push back against the Soviet Union, we certainly armed, the Afghan Mujahideen, but also groups of Arabs. We call them the Afghan Arabs, and they came from all over the Arab world, different estimates, some as many as 10,000, who fought and ultimately, pushed the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan. And one can make an argument that helped lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So a tremendous victory, but it came at a cost because what Afghanistan turned into then was a failed state. And so, and that's kind of you can talk about now our worries about our Afghan withdrawal as well, because terrorist groups take advantage of those empty spaces. And so that's what happened. And so these Afghan Arabs were certainly trained, but they flocked even more so to Afghanistan when the Soviet Union withdrew. This is in the 90s, and the United States kind of lost interest in that part of the world, and Al-Qaeda found themselves as part of the base. It's not necessarily the case, because there was such a great lapse in time. So it's not really that Al-Qaeda that we faced, after 9/11 are the same Afghan Arabs who fought the Soviets, a decade plus before. But fundamentally, I think they had the same beliefs, and they evolved from wanting to kick out the Soviet Union to then being opposed to the United States. I think it's an interesting lesson that the U.S. needs to learn as we support in our covert actions some indigenous groups who are perhaps doing something we want them to do. You do have to look at kind of the long-term effects, and that's fair to say. And I think that the CIA has taken a hard look at that as well.
Well, I think it's a fascinating part of what you talk about in the book is you're dealing with ambiguity, you're dealing with high-pressure situations. I love the title, Clarity in Crisis. You discuss high-pressure situations and how you make decisions there. So offer our listeners and viewers a template for what they need to think about when they're forced into a high-pressure situation and they've got to make some tough decisions.
So ultimately, and we'll start with where you want to get to be. You want to get to that place where there's ambiguity. When you have a lack of situational awareness, that's actually your happy place, and that's really hard sometimes because that's kind of counterintuitive. So my book talks about 9 core principles that you build over time as you build teams, as you lead, so that inevitably, when there is times, when times are tough, that you have no fear in this. I mean, that's the whole point. And there's a friend of mine once said, as we were kind of going into one of these situations, and we're like, boy, this is we're in the gray now, and he actually said to me, he goes, this is my happy place. This is where I want to be. So what does this mean? Well, it's building blocks. So one of the things I talk about consistently in the book is a principle I called adversity is the PED, the performance enhancing drug to success. So the point is you got to fail first before you're ever going to succeed down the line. And you can think of things like Michael Jordan getting cut from his high school basketball team, but in reality, it's that failure, that getting kicked in the teeth is going to teach you. You got to learn from that, and the next time you face a similar situation, you're gonna succeed. I think one of the themes in my book is that one of the principles I really espouse all the time is humility. You can't. I was at the tip of the spear of the U.S. government, but you can't believe your own hype. And so you follow these principles. I'll talk about another one. It's one of my favorites. I call it the glue guy or the glue gal, and that's finding the indispensable member of your team that perhaps is not the superstar. I use some great examples. One of them was what I called our doctors, our medical staff. We call them doc in the war zones. So I'm a case officer. Maybe you have some of the door kickers. We're trying to take down a high value target. There's the doc in the back. Now if that person is not taking care of us, is not doing kind of the right things, that team is not going to perform up to its capabilities. And so you kind of think through these principles. And as you build these teams to get to the point where you got to make those tough decisions, you're really comfortable doing so. And you can learn this. And that's the thing I really try to put forward in the book.
Yeah, I heard John Darcy's feelings before we opened up the Salt Talk by telling him he was not the glue guy at Skybridge, but that was actually a backhanded compliment, Darcy, because you, like Marc, are at the tip of the spear. This is more about somebody
like that
in the background tying things together. I thought it was a fascinating discussion about selfless people. And again, John Darcy is a team player. I like teasing him on these Salt Talks, but he's exceptionally talented at what he does. That'll be all the compliments you get from me, though, to the remainder of the year. So we'll just leave it there. I want to go to something that you write about. You're in a hotel room in Moscow. It's December of 2017, and you were debilitated with severe nausea, ringing in your ears, and what ultimately is known as Havana Syndrome. Tell us about that. Tell us what it is. Did they hit you inside the building, or they got to get you outside to create that kind of illness? What happens there?
Sure. So that was early December 2017. I was on what we call a temporary duty assignment, a short trip to Moscow. I'm at a 5-star hotel just 2 blocks from the embassy. It's the middle of the night, and I was kind of awakened to a start. I had incredible vertigo. tinnitus ringing in my ears. I felt like I was going to be sick. I had a splitting headache, and I knew something really bad happened. So it was inside the hotel room, which is frankly consistent to what you hear about some other victims of Havana Syndrome.
So the people above you and below you also probably got it then, right? Because they hit it, or they can isolate it into you.
I think the kind of the running theory now is that it can be really directed at you. So I think it was directed right at me in the hotel room. The fact of the matter is, when you go to a place like Moscow, there was no one to the left of me in the room and no one to the right. It was pretty clear I was under, heavy surveillance. I'd go down to the gym and I'd have some guy in a black, leather jacket following me down there. So, I think, my theory is that certainly it was set up for a kind of a directed attack at me. And that's very consistent with other, intelligence officers and diplomats who I've talked to subsequently who have, been hit by this. And it's a pretty insidious, kind of event, a pretty insidious weapon, because it's designed to incapacitate, not to kill. And it derailed my career. I had to retire at 50, which was not, I had a lot of gas left in the tank. But I had to retire, in July of 2019.
And so, but you also, there are other members. It's called the Havana Syndrome, because many of our diplomats and governmental workers, et cetera, have been afflicted by this in Havana. We think this is Russian inspired. Is that fair to say?
I think that's fair to say.
It's at a microwave pulse.
Yeah,
they hit your skull with.
So the theory is it's a directed energy weapon, which, by the way, we know the Russians have had before. And frankly, this technology is something that the U.S. government has as well. For example, there's companies that use directed energy weapons to knock drones out of the sky. And so this technology exists. It's just a matter of using it against another human being. There's a question on morality there. But yeah, there's,
no antidote for it so far.
So one of the things is I eventually got treatment at Walter Reed's National Intrepid Center of Excellence, which is the world's most renowned traumatic brain injury program. And they diagnosed me with a TBI, with a traumatic brain injury, based on an exposure event. And the theory is, whatever this kind of energy was, kind of got me in the back of my head. It's closest to the occipital nerve. And so, you're right, there's something that I can undergo treatment for, meaning, there are things I can do to make myself feel better. But ultimately it's something that we haven't found yet that can in any way be cured.
Well, all right. Well, we wish you great success with that. And I'm sorry that you're going through that, but I appreciate and admire your courage in talking about it, because by raising the awareness, hopefully it will reduce the number of our people that are exposed.
Right.
Let me switch gears. I'm going to turn it over to John Darcy in a second, because what he does at this point, Marc, is that he tries to outshine me by asking better questions than me. And then, of course, our guests say, "Oh, John, that's a great question," which always horrifies me and upsets me, but that's fine. We'll get there in a second.
Sure.
I have two last questions, okay? Question number one, which is important to me, is terror plots. You and I both know the United States has to go 100 for 100, 1,000 for 1,000. They only have to get it right once without giving up anything that's classified. Have we disrupted a lot of terror plots in the United States since 9/11? And where do you think we are today in terms of our safety here in the country?
So, I will say that is a great question. There you go. I'll preempt you saying that for John. No, there's no doubt that we have prevented numerous terrorist plots since 9/11. That's what CIA did. And I think if you CIA personnel, right after 9/11, we took this personally, because you have to be perfect. You have to bat 1,000. You got to be a soccer goalie, and you can't let a single goal in. And we felt that we failed. And so the efforts we made post 9/11 were really extraordinary in not allowing for a future attack. And I view that as success. America was not hit again. And whether you look at, core Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda in the peninsula, if you recall in the 12 to 2014 timeframe, there was all this threat streams became in public about threats against civilian U.S. airliners, serious stuff. And the CIA did incredible work to prevent Americans from dying. And, that's what we do. And I'm incredibly proud of it. The key on counterterrorism is that you can't take your eye off the ball. And right now, if you take a look at our, in our national security posture, we have China as an existential threat. I think people agree on that. You have Russia as a country that wants to do us harm, and counterterrorism has taken a bit of a back seat, but we got to be really careful on that. because just like, in the period before 9/11, we have to kind of continue to put kind of, money, people, resources towards the CT effort, because you can't fail. I mean, it's hard to say that in any endeavor you need to have a zero fail mentality, but in counterterrorism, that's what you got to have, and that's frankly what the American people demand.
Where are we today in terms of safety?
I think we're far better off. I think core Al-Qaeda has been degraded to a significant extent. What worries me, of course, you still have ISIS out there. And then kind of the key part now, I'm not as concerned about kind of a mass terrorist attack like we saw, on 9/11, but it's more of kind of either homegrown, inspired, individuals or kind of smaller units that carry out an attack. And I'll tell you one thing, if one person does something in Times Square or in the New York subway system or the DC Metro, not only think about the loss of life, even if it was small, it's tragic. Think about the economic costs that would come, at the United States. So I think you can never take your eye off the ball of counterterrorism, and I worry about the withdrawal from Afghanistan, frankly, because I think that we're asking again, kind of giving terrorists an opportunity to look for those empty spaces, those ungoverned spaces to reconstitute. So there's a lot of work that the United States still's got to do on counterterrorism, and even if we talk a lot about China and Russia, the CT fight, which was that really was what I did most of my career, and I'm really passionate about. I mean, that's got to continue. You never take your eye off the ball.
All right, I'm going to turn it over to John Darcys, but before I do that, I want to hold the book up again. It's Clarity in Crisis. Marc, it's a tremendous book. It's a brief, concise book, but it hits on a lot of different elements of what people need to think about when they're dealing with pressure situations, leadership, humility, glue, John Darcys, glue, holding things together. Okay. With that, I'm going to turn it over to John.
Thank you.
You touched on Afghanistan, Marc, and it's great to have you on the program. But I think it's an interesting topic. Anthony, as I mentioned in the opening, has been on troop support missions where he, after the trip, got these really detailed briefings, obviously no classified information, but detailed briefings from the generals on the ground about the situation in Afghanistan. Obviously, we've been there for almost 20 years. There's no real end in sight in terms of putting a neat bow on the entire situation. But at the same time, a withdrawal does create a vacuum whereby the Taliban probably regain some level of power and potentially create another haven for terrorist plots. If you were talking to the American people and they're coming to you and saying, well, we've been there for 20 years with nothing really to show for it. We continue to lose American lives and spend money with no end in sight. Why would we continue to pour money into that situation? I'm not saying that you necessarily disagree with them, but how would you explain to them the benefit of staying in Afghanistan, the benefit of not retrenching as a country into our borders?
So it would be kind of with the simple phrase that I like to say is defend forward. And so, we can't sit back, just because we're across the pond. When I say defend forward is we have to have a forward presence. Does that mean 100,000 U.S. troops? Of course not. But I think the issue of kind of troop levels in Afghanistan and Iraq has been taken over by politics, because ultimately we're talking about leaving 2,500 to 5,000 troops on the ground. That's nothing. We got 30,000 troops in Korea. We have, similar numbers in Germany. And so the idea of this need to go to zero, which is what they're talking about, that's where we're going to. To me, that seemed to be, really misguided. And it's almost a political decision to do this because it sounds good rather than keeping a very small residual force where we then can have the special operations and intelligence forces necessary on the ground with 2,500 to 5,000 U.S. troops. That's enough to kind of keep a lid on the counterterrorism situation. And so I would argue that the defend forward concept is not putting forward tens of thousands or 100,000 U.S. troops, leaving a small number of U.S. forces. That's what we do all over the world. That's what we could have done in Afghanistan. I don't agree with the decision to go down to zero. I certainly would not advocate going up to 50,000, but I think a small residual force where we can keep enough of a footprint to continue our counterterrorism missions is absolutely essential.
Right. You talked in your book, and you alluded to this earlier, about how adversity in your mind is a performance enhancing drug. And I think Anthony said something nice about me, so I'm going to say something nice about him. In the business world, he is a very resilient person in my mind. He's been through ups and downs, talks about it a lot in his books. Right. Obviously the gravity of some of the ups and downs that he's experienced might not compare to the things that you've been through. Could you talk about specific examples of failures, really deep, grave failures, even that you've experienced that you talk about in the book that affected you and how you trained yourself to be resilient and to become better as a result of those mistakes?
Sure. And so I think the story goes from Iraq and then ends in Afghanistan. And it starts in Iraq when I was up on, one of our teams that was living in the mountains of Kurdistan before the invasion of Iraq. And we had, we were running and recruiting an Iraqi agent. I was handling him. So it was a penetration of the Iraqi government. And he had what we call, very good order of battle information. So these are the disposition of Saddam Hussein's forces. And I pushed him. I was handling him. I pushed him too hard. So he was crossing the border, crossing the kind of the line between Iraqi Kurdistan and Iraqi regime controlled Iraq. But we had him cross too much. And this is my fault. This is on me. And he ends up getting caught and tortured and executed. And that really weighed on me heavily because it was my fault because I pushed him too hard. I was looking good back home in DC because the intel was flowing. Everyone was loving me. And I did something. I made a mistake and I got someone hurt. When it was likely not necessary. I fast forward that, and part of my leadership principles, I fast forward to my time in Afghanistan, and this was in 2011. And we were going after a high value target and an individual who had killed 2 CIA officers. But I was much more patient this time, and there was tremendous interest back home. But over time, and maybe a lot of false starts and we just patiently built the intelligence picture where finally we could put this high value target, what we call on the X, where he met his demise. That doesn't happen. That's success. And I'll say it was a success because we killed a high value target who was responsible for the deaths of CIA officers. That doesn't happen if I hadn't failed earlier. And failure for me earlier was pretty dramatic, as you said. And that's not necessarily going to be happen in every instance in the business community or elsewhere. But boy, I don't have that. We don't have that success later on if I didn't fail that first time. And I didn't really learn that lesson that was ingrained in me. And the story ends, it's pretty remarkable, where we that night from a fire pit along the Pak-Afghan border, we called the widow of one of our officers who was killed by this individual, this high value target. And we told her that, justice was served and that we avenged her husband's death. And, to me, that was a really powerful moment as we thought about what we had accomplished.
Yeah, I mean, powerful is right. I'm sure you can't talk about a lot of things that you've done and seen, but just the gravity of a lot of the stuff that you dealt with is just remarkable. But when you're in the heat of battle, and you talk about this in the book, and you're having to make decisions on the fly that are life or death decisions, what type of mindset, and you can apply some of this to business, which you write about in the book, what type of mindset or strategies or concrete steps do you recommend for people that are in the middle of a intense or a stressful situation to make sure they're thinking clearly and making sound decisions?
Sure. And so my principles kind of lead up to this, because if you've done several of the things that I talk about, that period of time where it seemed would be the most stress, actually you find some calm. That's why I call it, you find that clarity. And so ultimately, most of the time in high stress situations, you're going to have a basis. You're going to have kind of a core foundation of what you believe can be done. Now, for example, what I would do is as I build teams, and so think about, the end point, a high stress call you have to make. But I've built a team. I trust these other members of the team. They trust me. I've developed them. I've mentored them. I've given them opportunities to lead, in other situations. There's processes I've put in place. One of the keys I talk about, I call it the process monkey. But there's core foundational processes in the intelligence business that we've done. And so if you build that foundation, ultimately, when it comes down to it, the decision is not going to be difficult. I always talk about, emergency room scenarios. My stepbrother, his name is Matt Kaufman. He's a doctor in Brooklyn. He runs an ER there, and he's been on the front line with COVID. And so, when I call and I ask him and I kind of explain to him the principles of the book, he said, this is exactly what we face all the time. But what have they done? They have nurses, the glue guy or the glue gal. They have processes. You have to do things to prepare someone before an operation. Or if someone's coming in with a gunshot wound, you're going to do a couple things that are absolutely critical to ensuring that person's survival. And so you build those teams, you build those foundations, then ultimately when there is time to make a tough call, it actually isn't that tough. That's what I learned this. I realized this at the end of my career after a lot of failing, but I think it's really important because it can apply to the business world, in tremendous fashion.
Right. How is technology? So you had a 26-year career and you got to the very senior levels of the CIA. During that 26-year period of time, you lived through amazing technological innovation and change. How did your job change, and how has the job of the CIA changed in general as it relates to technology? Has it made it harder to combat terrorism because the threats are getting greater and there's more ways that people can hurt you using technology, or has it become easier because you have the ability to track people using technology, or how has it affected the job?
So that's, I think that you have to look at it from a couple different ways. You look at it from technology on, offensive standpoint, how do we use it more effectively? And then our defensive standpoint, because our adversaries can learn how to track us much more closely. And so both are really important. And then you kind of juxtapose that on top of the intelligence business is about humans. And so the one thing that hasn't changed is the relationship that I have with a source. It's an agent. An agent is a foreigner we've recruited. You spot, assess, develop, recruit, and handle someone. And that's a class on Psychology 501. So that never changes. That's a deeply personal relationship. And I talk about it in the book because it's extraordinary. I had all the time, especially as a junior officer, I had other people's lives in my hands. So that's going to remain the same. But how we innovate, offensively and defensively is absolutely critical. And I think that's where, especially when you see how our adversaries have the ability to track us, for example. I mean, look at biometrics, look at smart cities. Smart cities sounds really good. Smart cities is the bane of the existence of an intelligence officer. That means there's cameras everywhere. Well, I don't want that. So if I'm going out in the street to try to meet someone, I have to defeat that camera system. What does that mean? I can't look like the way I'm looking like. Even my gait, even the way I walk has to be different. Obviously, physically, I have to look different as well. I can't be carrying a cell phone. Where's my cell phone during this time? So all these things to kind of think of. So technology, we have to evolve with it, but don't forget it's the human intelligence profession is a personal one, and that's what I really love the most. I mean, when you sit down with someone, you're sitting across the maybe a hotel room, and this person says to you, Marc, your life is in my hands, and if you mess up, I'm going to die, and that happened. I talk about it in the book. Boy, that's a pretty weighty feeling on you, and it's something that you actually then kind of that you learn that's what drives you.
Right.
And so it's a Psychology 501 class. That's why I love talking about it.
Is that something that you feel like you were born with a certain skill set or a certain disposition that enabled you to be very effective in that job? Or does the CIA able to mold people and teach people the skills necessary to engage in that interpersonal aspect of being an officer?
So I think it's both. First, look, you got to love people. So I joke. I mean, I'm a Greek American. I'm outgoing. I'm always in people's faces and loud and all this. So you have you can be an introvert, but you got to love people. That's what you do. Now we are taught, how to conduct tradecraft. So we go to our it's a secret base somewhere, and you go off for a year, and you're taught how to run a surveillance detection route and how to put down a dead drop or mark a signal. Those are things that are taught. But I think the best CIA officers are those who are kind of intellectually curious. They certainly want to know about the world. My job was not to interact with Americans; it was interact with foreigners,
right?
And just to kind of have that thirst for knowledge. And then kind of the last part, obviously the people part is like I never served, in Paris or London. I was serving in the Middle East. So you got to be able to deal with some hardships, and sometimes your family's coming with you too. So whether I have great stories, we had no power, or the water runs out, or the apartment in a Middle Eastern city is infested with cockroaches. I mean, just crazy stuff that then you have this resilient family that kind of hangs on with you. But I think that the most successful CIA officers are just able to kind of roll with it. And I'll tell you one thing, maybe you both will relate to this. I mean, growing up in Central Jersey, that was a great lesson in how to join the CIA because my childhood was fun, and exciting, and loud, and that's what I kind of rolled into in my career.
Yep. So you write for the Washington Examiner. You write a frequent column, which I love reading, especially as we started preparing for this talk. I dug into a lot of your writings, but you're a fantastic writer. But you talked about in one of the pieces in the last 2 weeks, I think it might have been last week, another 4 stars were added to the agency's famous memorial wall for a total of 137. You talked about how you operate a lot in secrecy. You had to call a widow to tell her about avenging her husband's death, but the world doesn't even know what he did and what you did, frankly, to thwart terrorism or other threats to the country. How hard is it to operate in that secret type of environment and make those type of sacrifices for the country? What type of camaraderie develops within individuals in something like the CIA?
So, camaraderie is the kind of the best term that you use.
By the way, that was a really good question. Okay, USOB. Okay, I'll even admit to that. Go ahead, Marc. I'm sorry, I had to just jump in there.
No, it's good. Camaraderie is everything. One of the principles I talk about in building these teams is family values, and just that means having this love for one another and taking care of each other, and so camaraderie to me means things like each year I still gather with the team that I led in Afghanistan, at a little dive bar in Northern Virginia called the Vienna Inn. Camaraderie means when I came back from Iraq, the chief at the time, a guy by the name of Charlie Seidel, who has passed away, but he knew that a lot of us were suffering for some PTSD, and so he hosted us at his house on Cape Cod just to make sure we were all okay. I mean, it's a brotherhood and sisterhood. It's not a 9-to-5 job, and so the aspect of this being not just a job, but it's part of your identity. It's part of your way of life is really true. You're indoctrinated a little bit about that because you are considered the tip of the spear. It's hard to get in. It's hard, and then you have to kind of go through the selection to become an operations officer. But it's a pretty small fraternity. The clandestine service is actually quite small, and so there is a feeling that not necessarily that you're special, but you are part of something special. And so we are teams of officers, individuals, but it's also teams of families. I'll give you one story, and I love telling these stories, but. When I was in Afghanistan in 2012, my mom passed away in New Jersey suddenly, and I had to get home. And it was amazing. I was on the border. I was 7,000 miles away, and I had to take multiple helicopter flights and then a fixed wing to get home to bury my mom. And I remember the flight out of my frontline base. It was socked in with weather. Yet our helicopter pilots were like, "We're getting you out of here." And I remember, we're hovering in a mountain pass, and I'm on, I'm in night vision goggles and on comms with them, and I'm like, turn around, like this is too dangerous, and we didn't, and we eventually got to the next bases to eventually get home, and these are veterans of U.S. military special operations, the best pilots in the world, and I went to them, I said, why'd you do this? Like that was dangerous. And they said, Chief, and that's what they called me because I was the base chief, said, Chief, your mom died and we're getting you home, period. That's it. So how do you not have this affinity for your fellow men and women who you serve with when that's the kind of ethos that has been developed? And that's what I talk about when I talk about, family values. You kind of build that love and camaraderie and dedication to one another. And it's pretty spectacular. But that's the part that, people ask me, what do I miss in retirement? That certainly is the part that I really miss even today.
Right. From a mental health perspective, I think a lot of people that are in the military, they come out of service and they struggle to find that meaning that exists when you're in the throes of it. From a mental health perspective, is that a challenge for ex-CIA that come out, both finding that meaning and also coping with, some of the obviously heavy things that you see in action?
So, the answer is 100% yes. And one of the things that I've seen happen, and I don't like it, and I've actually talked to, and I've written about this in my Examiner column, but I've talked to the new CIA director, Bill Burns, about it, is why do so many kind of formers end up, we call them formers, these are the people who are retired, why are they leaving kind of bitter and disgruntled? And so I think that, that's not a good thing. And I think that a lot of it has to do with the transition to the outside world is so difficult. And so one of the things that I'm going to try to do is try to, find ways to kind of keep the formers more engaged with the building, because all of a sudden you go from having, the keys to the secrets of the planet to going out there and looking at the New York Times in the morning and scratching your head, wondering if that's actually what has happened. Because, a lot of times it's not. And so that transition is certainly difficult. One of the things that I think has been helpful for me is I decided, and after, some consultation with some other, former senior officials like Mike Morrell, we talked earlier about, former acting director of the CIA, a good friend of mine. I said, look, I think I want to talk and write about the agency, and it might be a little controversial, but this is an institution that the American people have to learn about for us to stay relevant and to educate American people. But for me, by doing so, I also still feel connected. So that's kind of how I have dealt with it. Is I wrote this book on leadership, and I like talking to the American people about the CIA, and so that transition for me was not as difficult, probably, but certainly for many others, it is. And it's some of my kind of columns that are going to come in the future are going to talk about kind of the mental health challenges that many kind of intelligence community and former military face when they leave service, because there's nothing like being on the tip of the spear for the U.S. government, but then it's gone. And then, it's time to kind of hang up your cleats, and then you don't have that anymore. And that's for many, that's really tough.
Yeah, it's hard to go from being the tip of the spear and thwarting terrorist plots to being, and this is no offense to IT consultants, but being an IT consultant for some large corporation. And
Right.
we work with a variety of organizations at the SALT conference, frankly, that help veterans find meaning when they come home. Team Rubicon is one of them. Jake Wood help veterans find meaning when they come home, and also deploy this special skill set that CIA officers and special forces have when they come home to the maximum benefit of society. So I think what you're doing in terms of talking about these things openly, not in a way that reveals sources and methods and things like that, but talking about them, I think it's valuable for people that have served and also for our society to make sure that we're learning from people like you. So Marc Polymeropoulos, thank you so much for joining us here on SALT Talks. Again, the book is called Clarity in Crisis: Leadership Lessons from the CIA. Anthony, come in and hold that book up again. He's a better promoter than I am.
No, the book is awesome, Marc. I really enjoyed reading it. It's a quick read, but it's got a lot of terrific content, and we want to get the word out. And we'll be doing a lot of social media alongside of you to help promote the book. And so thank you for your service to the country. And we want you to get better with the Havana Syndrome.
Thanks.
And we're very grateful to you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. It's great being here. Thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for tuning in to today's SALT Talk with Marc Polymeropoulos, talking about his new book, Clarity in Crisis. Just a reminder, if you missed any part of this talk or any of our previous SALT Talks, you can access them on demand on our website at salt.org/talks, or on our YouTube channel, which is called SaltTube. Anthony mentioned social media. We're on Twitter at SALT Conference is where we're most active, but we're also on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook as well. And please spread the word about these SALT Talks. Again, this is a subject matter that we think is very important for people to learn more about. But on behalf of Anthony and the entire SALT team, this is John Darcys signing off from SALT Talks for today. We hope to see you back here again soon.